Thank you for your patience, and Allison for your computer, and this is Mohammed Bouayad, and we're ready to go.
All right, I'd just like to apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't mean to take up any more time than you've already allotted. If you don't want to ask questions at the end, I totally understand. All right, so welcome to my economics senior seminar presentation. My name is Mohammed Bouayad. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I study economics and business administration. I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Black and Dr. Schneider for their assistance on this project. I'd also like to thank the economics department for helping me get to this point. And finally, I'd like to thank my parents for teaching me to always believe in myself. So the research process can be a difficult one for an undergraduate student for a number of different reasons, and I was no different. Some of the challenges that I had to overcome included staying on task because the research process can take you down so many different paths, choosing the right methodology to test my research question and hypotheses, and finally, trying to figure out what to do with all my data once I gathered it. On the other side of the fence, the research process can be a really rewarding experience as well. For example, I was able to gain a deeper understanding of a topic that I was once unfamiliar with. I was able to make a discovery after many long hours of hard work. And finally, I was able to apply all the skills and knowledge that I've gained throughout my time here at HC on this project. So this is a story about the NHL draft process, and it's interesting because it can help my favorite team, the Colorado Avalanche, win a championship. In addition, this project helps me in my future plans because I see myself working for a company and helping it become the most competitive version of itself it can be, and an MBA is not too far down the road. So overall, this entire experience is just a really good foundation for me to draw from when I enter the workforce. Now, we've all been exposed to professional sports in a number of different ways. Some of us view it as a form of entertainment. Others are born into families that force us to cheer on certain teams every week, and others just see bumper stickers on their way to work every day. But what a lot of people don't realize is that professional sports is an industry. That means we can analyze and examine it through an economic lens or perspective and gain some really valuable insight. So the rest of this presentation just goes through the research process that I went through, beginning with some background info on the NHL, moving into a literature review where I learned what research has been done in the field, what problems other scholars have run into, and what other opportunities lie out there. The methodology section where I test my research question and hypotheses. The data and analysis section where I gather all my information. And the conclusion section where I wrap everything up. To close this presentation, I'll open it up to any questions if you have any. So let's start off with some background info on the NHL. It was founded in 1917 as a North American ice hockey league with just 5 teams. Today it has 31 franchises, 7 of them are in Canada. Gross revenues are about $4 billion per season, and each team is worth around $517 million. Each team goes through an 82-game regular season, and those games are attended by about 20 million people. And my interest in this topic stems from my love for sports and my competitive nature. I really wanted to make a discovery or find a relationship that proved that I had the skills necessary to run, lead, and manage my own professional sports team. So that was kind of my motivation as I moved into the literature review, and one important aspect of that is to establish a theoretical basis for research. And so it begins with Bill James's paper titled Baseball Abstracts. His research question was, can it be estimated the number of runs a team scores in a season just by looking at their batting line? So this was a baseball-related question, and his conclusion was 8 runs off of what a team actually scored in a season. And he used an equation that included variables such as at-bats, walks, total bases, and hits. And there were a couple things that I took away from this study. The first being that we can use performance metrics to provide valuable insights. And the second being that he only tested it against one team, so we had no idea of knowing whether being off by 8 runs in a season was relatively close. So I knew moving forward, I'd have to have a very clear definition of what was significant and what was accurate. The second study that I looked at was titled Overconfidence in Case Study Judgments by Stuart Oskamp. His research question was, is a psychologist's confidence in his or her decision-making justified? And his conclusion was that as psychologists were given more and more information, they didn't necessarily become any more confident, but they didn't become any more accurate, but they did become more confident. Sorry, I'll explain that in just a bit. But the way that he tested it was by simulating a clinical situation with an actual case study of a man named Joseph Kidd. And what they did was split up his life into 4 stages, the first being just his demographic information, The second being his childhood years, the third being his high school and college years, and the fourth being later activities. What they did was construct a test that included what he would do in certain situations in terms of his actions or his attitudes in certain scenarios, and the psychologist would have to mark their answers as well as how confident they felt. What they found was that as more information became available, the accuracy on those tests didn't necessarily increase, but the confidence did. And so that applies to my research because I knew I didn't want to involve too many variables, because according to this study, all of that extra information doesn't necessarily make me any more accurate, but it could make me more confident. And that can lead to issues that are touched on in Richard H. Thaler's paper, titled The Loser's Curse, Overconfidence versus Market Efficiency in the National Football League Draft. Now, Richard H. Thaler is well known for winning a Nobel Prize in economics, and two of the main building blocks in the study or science of economics is rational decision-making and efficient markets. And so his question was, do NFL teams overvalue their right to pick in the draft? And using Oskam's paper's support, he said yes they do, because NFL decision makers are given so much information about their possible picks, they think they know exactly what they're going to get when they make a selection. However, we know that what they expected and what they got can be completely different things. And so what this results in is irrational decisions are being made in this field, and market inefficiencies are occurring. And the way that he looked at this was through the 2004 draft, where the San Diego Chargers used their first pick to select Eli Manning. The New York Giants had the fourth pick in that draft, and they also wanted to select Eli Manning because they thought he was the best quarterback in that draft. So they were willing to give up their fourth pick, their third round pick in that draft, in addition to their first and fifth round picks in the next year's draft. So essentially that means Manning was 4 picks more expensive than the next available quarterback. So what that tells us, interestingly enough, is the quarterback that was drafted after the New York Giants had their turns was Ben Roethlisberger. Now both Ben Roethlisberger and Eli Manning have the same number of Super Bowl championships at this point in their career, so it really calls into question how are we evaluating our draft prospects, which is the second part of my literature review. But at this point, I've established a theoretical basis for research because it allows me to go into a similar field and try to reduce the number of irrational decisions being made or find a simple process that will improve the efficiency of the market. So when we're talking about the different ways to measure value, I looked at 2 different studies. The first was titled Assessing the Relative Value of Draft Position by Aaron Barcelai, and what he did was plot the average value of each draft position relative to the first pick. The second study that I looked at was titled Relative Value of Draft Position in the NBA by Anhiraj Latave, and what he did was calculate an average performance value and compare it to the average wage for each draft selection in order to develop a team surplus for every draft position. And there were a couple things that I took away from these studies. The first is that the players that are the most productive bring the most value to the team. So it didn't really matter what statistics we looked at, the bigger the number, the more they produce for the team, which is a good thing. But the second thing is that the value was calculated after the player was drafted. So for my project, I focused on the 2012 to 2016 era, and I looked at all the rookie stats for everybody that was drafted during that time and focused on for as long as they were under their rookie contract. So these studies are just kind of similar to assessing a salesman. If I was a businessman and I hired some salesmen to sell my product, eventually after a certain amount of time, I'm gonna try to analyze my top salesman to make better decisions in the future. So I'll look at different things like his characteristics, his traits, his background, his education, his experience, and then I'm gonna try to mimic those decisions in future hirings so that I can continue to make my business better. So that leads me to decide what my variables are gonna be. My independent variables, draft position. All my other metrics are gonna be compared to as we go through the draft process. My dependent variables include compensation or salary earned. So a higher salary means that that player should be drafted earlier in the draft because they're expected to produce more. The performance metrics that I look at are point shares, which is the sum of offensive point shares, defensive point shares, and goalie point shares. It's basically an estimate of the number of points contributed by a player. So a higher point share score means that player should be drafted earlier in the draft because they're producing more for their team. The next one is goals created, and we calculate it by adding goals scored to 0.5 times assists, then multiplying by team goals divided by team goals plus 0.5 times team assists. And so a higher goals created score means that player should be drafted earlier because they are contributing more for their team. And the last performance metric that I look at is plus minus, which is the amount of goals that are scored for your team while you're on the ice, subtracted from the amount of goals that are scored against your team while you're on the ice. A higher plus minus means that you should be drafted early in the draft because you're producing more for your team. And the final one is a variable that I created. It's called the net value to the organization. And the reason I created this variable is because I don't believe we should find the value of a player just based off of one statistic. We should try to get a whole image. And so the way that we kind of account for that is by taking all the skill performance statistics that I just mentioned, adding them together, and then subtracting them from their skill compensation for that draft selection. So a higher NVO means that player should be drafted earlier in the draft. So to kind of give you guys a visual about what I'm talking about here, I believe that the draft pick is going to indicate and predict the productivity of the player in terms of these statistics. And so we should be seeing a negative relationship. To give you guys an idea of the data that I collected and analyzed, this is the first pick from the 2013 draft. His name is Nathan McKinnon, and he went to the Colorado Avalanche. His point share score was about 27, so he scored contributed about 27 goals per season. His plus minus was -4, so he was probably on the ice when they were being penalized and they were scored on a lot, so that's why it'd be negative. Goals created, 92, and his average salary is about $832,000. So his statistics aren't necessarily good or bad, but like what I'm trying to figure out is whether the draft pick indicates the productivity of the rookie, and then does that indicate the value to the organization? So that becomes my research question, which is there a statistically significant relationship between draft position in the NHL draft and net value to the organization? But in order to find the net value to the organization, like I said, we need to be able to see what the relationship is between draft position and all the other metrics that I mentioned. So they become my hypotheses. The first is that there is a statistically significant negative relationship between draft position and compensation. The second is that there's a statistically significant negative relationship between draft position and plus minus. The third is that there's a statistically significant negative relationship between draft position and point shares. The fourth is that there's a statistically significant negative relationship between draft position and goals created. And the fifth and final one is that, the big one here, is that there's a statistically significant negative relationship between between draft position and net value to the organization. My theory here is that the first pick should be the most productive and the highest paid, so all the other subsequent picks will be less paid and less productive, so the net value to the organization we should see decrease as we go through the draft. So in order to test these my research question, my hypotheses, my methodology is to use a regression test, where n equals 30 because there are 30 picks in the first round of the draft. That means my degrees of freedom are 28, and so I need an R value greater than 0.381 to be significant at the 0.05 significance level. So I run this regression test for each hypothesis and gather all that data and analyze it, and it leads me to these conclusions: that there was significant negative relationships between draft position and compensation, between draft position and point shares, between draft position and goals created, and between draft position and net value to the organization. All right, but there was one anomaly, and it was the fact that there was a statistically significant positive relationship between draft position and plus minus. So to remind you guys, plus minus is the number of goals that are scored for your team while you're on the ice, subtracted from the number of goals that are scored against your team while you're on the ice. And there are a couple reasons I think this happened. The first is that this was the only performance metric that I measured that could have been negative, and so I think that played a role in it. All the other performance metrics had to be positive, and they all illustrated negative relationships, but the one metric that I measured that could have been negative had the exact opposite effect. So I think that played a role in it. But it's also the fact that bad teams get early picks. So if you're picked earlier in the draft, you're playing for a bad team, you'll probably be on the ice more, you'll probably be scored on more, and that's where you see that negative plus minus. But as you get picked later in the draft, you're playing for a better team, you might be on the ice less, and so you'll be scored on less, and that's where we see a significant positive relationship. So what can we take away from this information? The first thing that I want to touch on is that economics affects our daily lives, whether we know it or not. So for example, if you still believe that professional sports is just a form of entertainment, or you bring another sibling to cheer on a certain team every week, or you just see another bumper sticker on your way to work every day, what I hope you realize is that economics can be used to understand how and why decisions are being made in certain industries, and that's some really useful and insightful information. The second thing that I want to touch on is the business model versus the sports model. So the professional sport team is just like any other business. They want to maximize their profit. And economics is a great tool to help a company achieve those goals. But when we're talking about professional sports teams, they have the secondary, just as important goal of trying to win as much as possible. And so that's where this study was geared towards. So if I was the Colorado Avalanche decision maker and I saw this study in front of me, I would see that the net value to the organization decreases as we go through the draft. And so that's going to affect my strategy on draft day. That's going to affect the way that I decide to build my team. And all of that affects the way that we chase a championship. So there's some real life applications as well. Finally, this study gives us insight into how rational businesses make decisions that they believe will maximize their returns. In other words, we all make decisions based on our own self-interest. The problem with that is that we don't have free, readily available, completely available information, and so that results in irrational decisions and inefficient markets. So this is my plea to you guys that we should all be majoring in economics, because then we can make many discoveries in many industries that makes information much more readily available, that lessens the number of irrational decisions that we make, and then improves the market's efficiency overall. So we're going to live in a better world completely. All right, so if you want to further my research, you could look at multiple rounds, since the first round of the draft isn't the only round. We could look at different eras. I only focused on the 2012 to 2016 era just because of the way the rookies are paid during that time. Or you could take a look at the different variables, such as the strength of the draft. The skills of the prospects can change from year to year. Or you could take a look at the skill of general managers, because they definitely, some of them are more better at developing offensive talent versus defensive talent, or some of them prefer hometown talent versus international talent because they want to expand their fan base. But they would all provide some really interesting results. With that, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you guys might have. I hope that this has been an educational and enjoyable experience for you, just as it was for me. And I'd like to take the time to thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about my economics project. Thank you. Yes.
Mohammed, could this be correlated into other studies and, not studies, but into other sports?
Absolutely, absolutely. If you wanted to further my research in that way, he was asking if we could take this study and apply it to other sports. Definitely. The one thing that I found when I was doing this is I had to take some time to figure out what statistics you want to use. I definitely thought the statistics that I chose kind of really affected the way that you bring productivity to the team. So whatever sport you choose, you just have to make sure that you choose statistics that should affect the team in a positive way.